Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Dave Vaughan, and I'm Executive Director here at the Mote International Center for Coral Reef Research and Restoration. And I know that's a very big name and a fairly long name, but it tells exactly what we do here in the Florida Keys. Mote, spelled M-O-T-E, is the last name of one of the donors, Mr. William Mote, who started and helped fund an Oceanographic Institute in Southwest Florida. Because of the actual efforts of Dr. Eugenie Clark 62 years ago, we nicknamed her our First Lady of Sharks, and she was really the first female oceanographer, marine biologist that was known around the country and around the world. She was actually better known in the Red Sea than even Jacques Cousteau. Well, she left a legacy of an Oceanographic Institute, which today has about 150 scientists, 30 programs, a number of PhDs, and thousands of members who become part of Mote Marine Laboratory and Aquarium. I happen to be able to direct the program down in the Florida Keys, almost as far as you can go on US 1 and the entire east coast of the United States. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something a little different. It's actually about our coral reefs, but it's not the kind of news of just why we're losing some of our corals, which are endangered and threatened, but maybe some of the first good news of how we can save coral reefs and save it in our lifetime. So I'm going to start off with a small video that was actually put on by the American Association of Retired People, or AARP. Yes, that means I'm an old person, and it means that they did a video once and an interview in a magazine of theirs for trying to find 25 people who basically busted the myth that you have nothing to do after you are too old, or that you let age make a difference in what you feel you have capabilities. And I was one of the lucky ones that was highlighted in the magazine. For me, it was because I made the statement that I don't want to retire until I plant 1 million corals. And that sounds like an unbelievable task. But I hope to accomplish that in just the next 1 to 5 years. And hopefully it is the first example to show what people can do at any age, including very young, and what we can do to actually turn around the types of things that are taking place on our natural ecosystems, and that we can make a difference one coral at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and play this short few-minute video. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll talk to you afterwards and have time for questions in just a few minutes.
Most people don't know this, but we've lost 25 to 40% of the world's corals. And if you wonder if that'll make a difference or not, you should ask yourself, do you like to breathe? Land plants only produce about 1/3 the oxygen we breathe. The rest comes from the ocean. I'm Dr. Dave Vaughan, and I'm the program manager for coral restoration at the Mote Tropical Research Center in the Florida Keys. I actually grow coral for planting back out on the reef. It's been coined as my eureka moment, or eureka mistake, where I broke a coral into tiny pieces, and I thought it was going to die and be very stressed. And instead, it grew like the dickens. Each of these, in just a few months, grew to the size that would have taken a few years. It was after that accident that I knew that we could restore reefs, and it was really a new lease on life and a new brightness of what this whole career in coral research could do. This is what I'd like to call the ocean simulator. So we can actually simulate what the water will be like 100 years from now, so we can try to forecast which of these corals are still going to be winners and utilize the ones that we know will be better adapted in the future to those conditions. The other thing to remember is that we know that your skin, if it grows very fast, is called cancer or tumors. So if we can understand what turns on fast growth of tissue in a coral or what slows down tissue, we might be able to have remedies for tumors or cancer. These are the people that really do the heavy lifting and the real work here. I could not do this myself.
When we can include student scientists as well as the older generation, you get a lot of transfer of experience and data so that we're not committing the same mistakes.
I always wondered how long it would be that I'd still be able to dive. Now I know you can dive as long as you want. So you're never too old to dive.
Dr. Vaughan gets in the water like everyone else, and he, if anybody, has seen the decline even more than any of us have. You know, he saw it when it was beautiful. How I may see it when I'm Dr. Vaughan's age, maybe the way he saw it when he was my age. So we're going to switch the generations, and I can finally see maybe what the reef looked like 60 years ago versus now.
I'm not going to retire until I hit 1 million corals planted back on the reef. With the right conditions, we can do it in the next 3 to 5 years. People think that we've ruined this planet by technology, but with technology, we can bring it back.
Well, I hope you liked the video. A lot of people have been able to see that and start to wonder what we can do in helping our oceans. And there are a lot of things you can do. For one thing, we are now developing the technologies to plant corals underwater that is very similar to how when I was growing up, we learned how to plant trees in forests if they burned down. We also learned that we could actually take areas of the land that were special and maybe put them in a management area where we would make them good for all people. For instance, we made national parks and state parks and wildlife management areas and preserves. And we've got to realize that we have to do the same thing underwater. Corals are actually less than 1% of the bottom of the ocean, and yet they're responsible for over 25 to 40% of the world's fisheries. Well, that sounds pretty incredible. But if you think about it, if the bottom of the ocean is mostly just sand bottom or mud substrate, but then every once in a while you have this area that is called a coral reef that is just booming with life. If you were an animal on an oasis or a desert, you'd want to be found where the oasis was, not in the middle of just bare sand. And it's the same for the fish. They have a habitat to hide in, just like a forest. They have areas to breed in. They have areas to feed in. And they have areas for the juvenile young to grow up. And that's what our reefs are. So if we lose our reefs, it'll be quite a shame for a number of reasons. One is our seafood supply and our fishery. The second is just our ability to have a beautiful place to snorkel, to scuba dive, or to swim. If you can imagine if we lost all of our parks, forests, and rainforests, what a terrible thing that would be. But we've learned now that we could actually grow a tree back in a rainforest. And so now we're learning that we can grow the underwater rainforest by way of producing corals very fast and also producing corals in large numbers. And that's what we're doing. And so I think there is an actual potential for most people who, like me, wanted to grow up and be a forest ranger. that now you can have the dream that you might like snorkeling, or you might not like skin diving and scuba diving. And you may say, I want to be an underwater park ranger, and I want to manage underwater marine protected areas. Or I want to be a forester underwater. I actually want to go and replant the underwater habitat that is really like the trees in the forest, but for the fish under the sea. There are a lot of things that we can do. There's a lot of things that you can do. Most people first ask me, so why are corals important? Well, I usually tell them the typical things like I just mentioned about fisheries, but they're also a big economic benefit. Here in the Florida Keys and South Florida, the economy related to the reef is probably worth close to $5 billion. And we have millions of visitors that come to this area that like to swim, snorkel, and call this area a place of vacation or tourism. But we also have a few other things that are important. Most recently, we had a very large hurricane, Hurricane Irma, which in September came and plowed directly into the south part of the Florida Keys. It first was thought from NOAA buoys and weather stations that the waves coming into the Florida Keys were probably 25 to 35 foot tall. Luckily, we have a coral reef, a barrier to those waves, close to 5 miles from shore. And so it was thought that those 25 to 35 foot waves actually broke over the reef and only came ashore here a few miles later at just a few feet tall. Could you imagine a 25 to 35 foot wave breaking over the highway of the Florida Keys, South Florida, Miami, all the way up through Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach? Life as we know it along the coast of South Florida would not be possible if we didn't have a living coral reef that was a barrier to waves. And so we should thank coral reefs for not just the kinds of things they do as biological or economical, but just the ability to live along the coastline. I'm hoping people actually don't have to wonder what the real value is before we actually look to see why we save something. Just in the beauty of it, just in the potential that our oceans are really what drive this planet as a blue planet. The health of our oceans is directly related to the health of human beings on this earth. And so if we don't have a healthy oceans, we will not have a healthy planet for us. So what I want you all to think about is that if that is the scenario, and coral reefs seem to be the first canaries in the coal mines that are telling us that something's wrong of our oceans, we should not only pay attention to protect our oceans and ourselves, but we should look to try and get coral reefs in a spot where they are a functioning ecosystem again. And we're doing that through planting. I hope to be one that says I can plant 1 million corals in the next few years. And if I train or you train as another coral biologist or coral ecologist and can do conservation in the form of planting corals yourself, then we can make a big difference on this planet. So with that, I'll try to actually take some time for questions from those of you who are listening. And if any of you have some ideas or questions that you may have, go ahead and type them in as the message, and I'll try to answer them for you. Okay, many of you may participate in habitat restoration types projects already, but most of them are probably on land. For instance, there's a lot of projects in restoring maybe a forest, or ones in restoring a place where there might have been a creek, or there may be ones that are special to wetlands or dunes or mangroves. So if you have something that it is actually a very good start to know what you can do on land, and just know that we can start to do the same thing underwater. Well, I have a question here from Horn Elementary, and they're asking how close I am to my goal. Well, I'll tell you how close I am, but that may sound like I'm still far away. I've probably planted and been responsible for close to 50,000 corals being planted. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but just think that 10 years ago, I started working with corals, and it took us 6 years to produce just 600 corals. Today, we cut and plant 600 in a single day. So last year, we planted 20,000 corals. This year, we're hoping to plant 35,000 corals. Next year, 50,000 corals. By next year, I'll be at my goal of close to 100,000 being planted. But it is an exponential type of math program. When we start with one coral the size of a golf ball, we'll break it into 20 to 50 smaller pieces, and in 4 to 6 months be ready again. So let's do some math. If I had a coral this big, and I could break it into 50 pieces, then in 6 months I would have 50 corals, and each one of them I would be breaking into 50 pieces. So I'd have 50 pieces times 50 pieces, so I'd have, how many is that? Does anybody have good math out there? Okay, we'd have 2,500 corals. So what would happen if I took 2,500 corals, and then 6 months later, which is just 1 year from now, I multiplied them by 50 again? So for all of you out there, let's see how good you are at math. We have 25,000 corals. We're breaking each one into 25,000, into 50, and we have, yes, 125,000 corals. Okay, now let's say we did that again. Now we're a year and a half away. We take 125,000 corals, we break them into 50 corals each. Oh yes, that's a very big number. Who has the biggest calculator out there or the fastest phone? I'll wait for some answer. Oh, that may be too much math for everybody to do on their own. But just think, 125,000 is, yes, over 6 million corals. So that's just 2 years from now. My goal is only 1 million corals. So it's possible to do that in under 2 years. And I think I've got 2 to 5 years to work on it. But if all of you in the future are going to help me, we can make that million mark before it's too long. Well, you might notice that if I had a video on AARP that I must be kind of old, and I'm 65 this year. And by the color of my hair, you might say, oh my goodness, tell me that, how are you going to plant 1 million corals? Well, I hope to still be alive in 2 to 5 or 10 years. And so we can plant 1 million corals in our lifetime, even a lifetime of an old person like myself. But it's going to take people of your generation to continue to do this and see if there's many places around the world that this can take place. So let's see if there's any more questions that you have. Let's see. There are many species of corals. For instance, we have about 28 species of corals here in South Florida, and about 35 species maybe in the Caribbean. In the Pacific Ocean, there's a couple hundred species of corals. And so there are a lot of corals, just like a lot of trees, that we can have this capability of planting many. We grow all 28 species at our laboratory, but we highlight about the top 6 or 7 species that, just like you might know with a forest, I'm going to plant a forest that I know has a total of 30 species of trees, there's probably some like oaks and maples that are the dominant species. And so there is also underwater. We have a dominance of some corals called elkhorn coral that looks like an elk or a moose's antlers, staghorn coral, which looks like a deer's antlers, boulder coral, which looks like a big round sphere, mountain coral, which makes also like a big boulder. We also have brain coral, which looks like the grooves in a human brain, and a few species of those. So we're planting brain corals, mountain corals, boulder corals, elkhorn corals, and staghorn corals as our major species, because that's what's out there normally. So we've got a few more minutes if there are a few more questions from anybody from out there in their classrooms or from in their homes that would like to ask. We have a number of different things that most people ask, and I can answer some of those as well. We can actually do some things where people ask me, well, what is a coral? Sometimes they ask me, why are we studying corals? Don't we know everything we need to know about corals? If somebody asks me that question, I usually ask them a question back. So, do you know what a coral is? And you know what? Most people have to stop and think about it. And a lot of the answers are, well, I'm not sure. Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Is it a mineral? Is it a microbe? And I say the answer to that is yes, 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 and yes. So it's all of those things. It's an animal polyp that grows inside its tissue an aquatic plant called an algae, and grows on the outside of the mucus of its polyp a specific microbial community, and pulls calcium and other minerals from the water and deposits a mineral skeleton underneath it, basically looked at as the coral skeleton. And so it is an amazing creature that we actually do not know too much about. And so it is amazing that we don't know so little about it at this time. In fact, we didn't even know or realize how corals reproduced until the 1980s. Could you imagine if we said that about any other thing, like a fish or an apple or a giraffe or a chicken? But yet we didn't know enough about corals to even know that they had an amazing cycle in the summer where they broadcast gametes to try and reproduce. There are other facilities in the United States that actually are trying to do the same thing. For instance, in Florida and in the Caribbean, there's over 38 different projects doing what we call coral restoration, coral propagation, or sometimes called coral gardening. Of those 38 operations, 36 of them are only working on the one fragile branching coral called staghorn. Remember, that's the one that looks like a deer's antler. And it is actually evolved to break very easily, and it is easy to grow in the field or underwater and actually grow more. It's a fast-growing coral, and then plant it back out. There's only 2 of those 38 that actually have added another species to it. And we're the only place that actually does all 28 species, including all of the massive corals. And so we hope to train other people from around the country and around the world, actually, who have coral reefs, how to grow more than just the fast-growing branching corals. So just like in the land, you wouldn't want to plant just one kind of tree back in the forest, especially if it was one that was just a fast-growing bush, but you want to grow all the kinds of trees and plants in there. Another question was, do reefs go through succession like terrestrial environments? If so, are you planting pioneer species? That's a very good question. And actually that fast-growing species I mentioned, the staghorn or the branching coral, is one of the first successional species. It's fast growing, and just like if you had a forest fire in a piece of land, you might get some small ferns or small plants, small bushes starting immediately. Those are the ones that are small plants, small bushes starting immediately. Those are the ones that are fast colonizer. But it's the slow-growing massive corals like the brain coral, like the boulder coral, like some of those massives that we're planting also. People ask me, and this is from Rhiannon, what did I study in school and what jobs have you had before working with coral? That's a really good question. And actually, I knew at a very early age, at age 13, that I wanted to do something in the marine environment. I actually got to read Jacques Cousteau's book, The Silent World, and it rang true to me in something I wanted to do. I started to ask my parents if I could be a scuba diver. Well, back then, a 13-year-old usually was not thought of as one that could learn to be a diver, since there weren't many divers then. But they actually turned around when they looked and they figured out I wasn't going through just a phase, because back then they had figurines that were either cowboys, Indians, or soldiers, but instead of being made out of plastic, back then they were made out of lead. They were lead figurines. And they found me one day in my basement melting down my lead army soldiers and making scuba tank weights for weight belts for diving. And then they figured that, oh boy, I guess I won't be talked out of it. It's not just a phase. And they helped me to allow me to follow my dreams. But my dreams weren't specific to one thing underwater. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to work on seagrasses or seaweeds or sharks or clams or oysters or corals. And in fact, through my education in both college and in graduate degree in a master's and in a PhD at a university at Rutgers University, I did work and finally got a job, but in an area of growing clams and oysters because I had experience in growing algae. And so there are actually a whole list of things that I got experience in, from being able to work with bivalves, shellfish, fish, marine ornamentals, marine corals for the aquarium trade, and finally corals for restoration. So as I tell a lot of people, I still haven't figured out what I want to be when I grow up, because I've bounced around between clams and oysters and shrimp and fish. But at least I knew I was having fun learning which I did like and which I didn't like. So don't ever worry if you don't completely know what you want to be when you grow up. At the time, you feel like you still have a lot of exploring to do of the areas that you want to know you like when you finally pick a career or a direction and path. So what I would suggest to most of you is first, do what your dreams say and follow those dreams, because you want to get a job that actually you like working in and it doesn't even feel like a job. Second is, I would say that you have to get good grades. Almost everybody knows that you really need A's and B's. So what happens when you're in a classroom of 30 people and you all get A's and B's and you all apply to the same college or you all apply to the same job? Well, if all of you have A's and B's, how am I supposed to pick which is the best one to accept as an employee or as a person into a graduate school or a college? I look at all the other independent types of experiences you have. And for instance, if you stay after school and do a project with your teacher, if you do an independent study, if you spend the summer and go to some sort of camp or project, if you do a science fair project, if you do an internship or a volunteership in something you think you might like, You end up finding that you like it or not, and you also get experience on your resume that will make your resume stand out different than the rest of the people that also have A's and B's. And so try to keep following your heart and the dreams that you want to do, and also try to get experience in areas you think you might be interested in, so you'll really know if that's something that you want to do for the rest of your life. And it'll also give you the experience to have a better chance of being accepted into a job or into a school that will let you study that a little bit further. Okay, we're actually getting along, and Bridget asked another question. How big of an area are you replanting? Well, we're planting, actually, if you can see in the back, this is a picture of an area of a reef that is about 30 feet by 30 feet. And we've planted about 3,000 corals in this area. And so we've increased the population by probably 50%. And we figure that if you're increasing the population by as little as 25%, you have functionally restored that area back to the way it used to be in the number of corals a few years ago. But today, with our plantings, we're planting in areas that are multifaceted. We're planting in areas that are probably 50 miles long, from the lower Keys near Key West all the way up to near Marathon, which is halfway up the Keys, and probably in an area that's close to 50 acres. So 50 acres of corals have been basically restored, and we're looking for another 50 acres this year to restore. So you can look at it as miles of coastline, or you can look at it as acres, or you can look at it as number of corals planted back in. They all are something that actually gets you an idea, and what I hope to have is areas that at some point people go back and say, wow, this is great. I remember how it used to be, I remember how it got degraded, and now I remember and can see how well it's been restored. Just as if you've seen a forest, you heard it burn down, and then you went back and people have replanted the forest and it's growing again. Okay, there's also some questions about being warmer and ocean acidification, so I'd like to touch a little bit on that. We know that in Florida, we started to get some problems with our corals in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we had one time where we had what's called coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is caused by the temperature through climate change getting much warmer, too warm for the corals. So they actually spit out the pigmented algae that's inside their tissue. And when they do that, they look like they're clear. And because they're clear, you can see the beautiful white calcium carbonate skeleton, which is the minerals they produce. And when that happens, they look like they're bleached white. But when that happens, they've lost the algae that performs the function of producing, actually through photosynthesis like a plant, some sugars which it shares with the corals and with the bacteria that grows on the coral. This becomes its immune system, and this is one that is a situation where we lost in the 1970s bleaching event probably 15, maybe 20% of the corals. But it was thought then that bleaching and high temperatures only happened once every 100 years. So we thought we had time for them to recover. But in the 1980s, we had 2 bleaching events back to back, and we lost a little less each time, only about 5% each time. But now, in the past 14 years, we've had bleaching 12 of the past 14 years. So if you think that climate change and increased temperatures is just a theory, I would like to ask you to ask the corals what they think about that. Because for the past 12 to 14 years, they have been stressed almost every summer with high temperatures. But they're also stressed with temperatures the reverse. Climate change actually makes hotter summers, but it also makes colder winters, and they don't like either of those. If you walk into a pet store, they're going to say, if you want to grow corals in your saltwater aquarium as a reef tank, you should keep the temperature between 76 degrees and 78 degrees. Well, that's not what we've done to our oceans. Our oceans now down here get as cold as 60 degrees to as warm as 90 degrees. And the corals are the first ones to be noticing that that is a very big stressor for them. We also know that CO2, besides causing high temperatures, actually get dissolved in the ocean and causes a situation called ocean acidification, where the pH, or the amount of acid in the ocean, becomes higher. And when that happens, corals actually have a harder time not only being able to get calcium to form their shells, but also the high temperature, which stresses them during that time. So what we've done is we've taken the corals that have survived those high temperature and ocean acidification increases from the past 30 years, the ones that didn't die through those periods, and we're making more because they're naturally resistant. But what we're also doing, as you saw in the film, is we're testing some of these to see which ones will still be okay in the conditions of temperature, both in 20, 50, and maybe 100 years from now, in your generation and your children's generation, and trying to forecast which are the best corals to plant so that make sure that they are functioning and acting as an ecosystem as they're supposed to in the next decade to next century. So I'm hoping that's something that all of you will do. We think we can look to genetically maybe select the ones that are here, maybe not in genetic modification, but in actually an engineering way like everybody has done with both racehorses, plants, trees, tomatoes, and the kind of dog you like as a furry animal as your pet. And so we might be able to actually naturally select those attributes and have a better time in the future. If you want to learn more about what we do at Mote Marine Lab, you can go to our website, M as in Michael, OTE.org, O-R-G, and you can look up Mote Marine Laboratory and my program on coral reef restoration research on that website. And there's a few other longer videos that you can pick and watch at your leisure. Storms is something that has been very dear to my heart just recently, since we had a very, very big hurricane here. And that's a scenario where actually those fragile branching corals, if it's a small storm, they will break, possibly land in a hard bottom in a crevice in the reef and actually reattach. If it's too big a storm, though, they get blown away and land in maybe mud or sand, roll around, and will not survive. The massive corals do much better during the storm. And so what we found in the hurricane here, that the fragile branching corals did not fare as well, but the larger, bolder corals, brain corals, mountain corals, did much better. And so we had some negative effects on the reef just in physically moving some of them. But it was amazing to see how well adapted the massive corals to even a Category 4 storm like we had here in the lower Keys. Deb asked how important are mistakes or accidents in scientific research. His ideas or mistakes are bad, and it's really, I have to tell you that I've had more mistakes and more good results from them than many others have. The ability to find that this little coral that we first grew from sexual reproduction and recruitment is one where I accidentally broke it into a small piece and found out that that piece grew very quickly. In other sessions, what you have to do as a scientist, though, is then basically employ the experimental scientific method. So my accident was I broke a coral into a bunch of small pieces and it grew very fast. The science and the experiment was to repeat that, making a control that wasn't cut, but taking others and cut them into small micro fragments and watching them again and repeating that to make sure it happened with other species as well, and in fact it did. So I would say do not be afraid of mistakes, just be observant that what mistakes may mean. If we knew the answer to every question at the end of it, then it already would not have been a question. But for every question, there's always an unknown factor and a new question that is brought up. And so the mistakes may or may not be a window into the answer of why these things are changing differently. So always follow a mistake and see why it is doing it differently. Okay, well, I think I've answered most of the questions. If you still have a few more, go ahead and type them in. And then, if not, we will sign off. But I see one about the question from Donna about, do bleached corals actually die off? And that's a very good question. And that is, during the time they bleach, they're actually still alive. So being bleached doesn't mean necessarily that it's dead. It just means that it's lost the algal component. But the algal component is one that helps it energy by supplying half its nutrition. So if it stays in that state of being bleached for a long period of time, it will eventually starve to death. It will also lose the ability of that microbial community that produces the natural antibiotics that actually are their immune system. So they might also be more susceptible to diseases. And so the quicker the temperature rebounds, the quicker the coral can start to grow or absorb more algae and actually get back out of a bleaching event. Bleaching events sometimes could be just 1 or 2 corals, or it could just be for a few days. We have had what we call a global bleaching event, where large areas and large number of organisms bleached, and they bleached for many weeks. And that's the part that is very disturbing. So we do not want to see bleached corals after a long period like that, which is a good tendency that they will die off. So bleaching is just basically just like somebody having a fever and get sick. So it's a time for them to be healed. And if we don't heal them soon and then make the way back out of that stress or out of that illness, then they will or could eventually die off. So what we want to do here is be able to see that the entire ocean is actually something that is affected by everybody. Even if you were a student in the Midwest, you can be involved in actually the effects on coral reefs for a number of things. For one thing is that all of the United States has what they call basically a drainage basin. Everything from the Rockies to the east goes into the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. Everything from the Rockies to the west goes into the Pacific Ocean. So actually what you do on your house lawn in the Midwest, or what you do on your farm, or what gets placed into your creek goes into your rivers, goes into the major rivers, and comes to the oceans on either side. So we're really dependent on what everybody in the interior of the United States places on the ground, soils, runoff, and finally creeks, rivers, and streams. And we're also dependent on what you put in the atmosphere. It's a global problem for carbon dioxide. So if in the Midwest you decide that you want a faster car that only gets 10 miles per gallon, instead of maybe a more efficient car that might get 20 miles per gallon, or a hybrid that gets 50, or an electric car that uses no gasoline, then you are actually helping. Because you can all help by not doing something more than just recycling one aluminum can. It's got to be because of what everybody changes in their lifestyle, and that's having a lower input and footprint on the carbon cycle of this planet. So you want to basically use good resources, you want to reuse, you want to conserve, and you want to work as little down on the carbon cycle as you can. Well, Donna asked about books, and I'm glad you asked that. There are not too many books out there, but I am in the process of writing a book called Active Coral Restoration. And that's because people have talked about coral restoration before, but coral restoration was this, if an anchor damaged physically a reef, they would go in and maybe patch it with some cement. Active restoration is actually going and planting live corals back on the reef. And that's the new technology. It's actually going and planting live corals back on the reef. And that's the new technology. And I hope to be writing a book that's available later this year called Active Coral Restoration, as one that will show how people are trying this all over the countries of the world, and how we have lessons learned from each trial, and also what are the general best management practices we know of today. So thank you for that question. There's nothing we do actually to promote growth once we plant the coral out. We do sometimes feed the corals in our land-based nursery, but once it's planted back out on the reef, it's up to Mother Nature for how fast it grows, or how much food, or how much sunlight it goes. So once they're out planted, that's pretty much about it. And just like once you've planted a tree in the forest, there's not too much you can do in a wild area. There's some you can do on your own farm if you're cultivating, but we don't cultivate them anymore once we outplant them back into the natural environment. Okay, we have noticed an increase in a little bit of everything, and we're starting studies to see how many more invertebrates we see on a reef that has live corals, how many more fish we see on a reef with live corals, and we'll follow that over the next few years. This is the first really few years of planting coral, so we don't have a lot of data based on monitoring and observations. But those are two of the areas we're working with. We're actually working with one of the professors from the Chicago Field Museum, Dr. Rudiger Bieler, who's a specialist on marine invertebrates. And he's looking to see what marine invertebrates populations are changing on the reef. We're also working with a doctor from Jacksonville University, and we'll be able to see with his students, actually for long-term following, whether they see any differences in the fish populations over the years. So there's a lot of long-term ones that we feel that we should be watching. We're also watching some of the non-endemic species, sometimes termed invasive species. For instance, we have a non-native lionfish, a very pretty fish to look at, but it's one that doesn't have a predator so far in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean species. Released accidentally, now has taken over to this warm environment of Florida and the Gulf of Mexico. And it eats many, many, many of the fish juveniles that we like to have saved. And everybody is looking at, once it's released now, how do we get rid of it? There are a few more invasive species of different gastropods and bivalves and other organisms that we're looking at basically as well. Well, it's been a very pleasure talking with you all. I'm hoping that you all got to shovel out your snow in the Midwest. And I'm hoping that you got a few minutes of looking at this film to see what the warm coastal areas are. Come visit us down in the Florida Keys or in the Caribbean. And I hope all of you that in the future want to look at this as a career can either apply for a student internship or come to one of our middle school or high school one-week camps we have during the summer here at our Coral Reef Research Center. Or maybe I'll be seeing you as a scientist coming through our laboratory, such as our visiting scientists and students. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for all of you for listening. And with that, have a very good time, and let's grow more coral.